Intersectionality and Antisemitism, A New Approach by Karin Stoegner. Karin Stoegner is Professor of Sociology at the University of Passau, Germany, and coordinator of the Research Network on Racism and Antisemitism in the European Sociological Association. In this important essay, she explains why the influential theory of, quote, intersectionality, end quote, so often fails to include global anti-Semitism and suggests a radical new approach that should command the attention of social theorists and political activists alike. Intersectionality is an analytical instrument for critically understanding the multidimensionality of power relations. It emerged first in the 1970s in debates on black feminism and signaled an intersectional struggle, i.e. a struggle on two fronts against sexism within the civil rights movement and against racism within the women's movement. In this respect, intersectionality has always been an analytical concept and a political practice. Currently, global anti-Semitism is only rarely included in intersectional theory, and Jews are often excluded from feminist anti-racist social movements that claim to be guided by intersectionality. The vehement anti-Zionist orientation of some of these movements, be it the Women's March on Washington, Chicago Dyke March, or Black Lives Matter, poses the question, why does the intersectionality framework routinely exclude anti-Semitism? In this essay, I will first contrast anti-Semitism and racism before showing that anti-Semitism research and intersectionality need not necessarily exclude each other. I will go on to develop a specific approach to intersectionality that views ideologies in relation to each other, reads anti-Semitism itself as an intersectional ideology, and reads those forms of intersectional theory and practice that exclude Jews as themselves invoking anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism and racism, a complex relationship of similarity and difference. The difficulties in analyzing anti-Semitism within the intersectionality paradigm arise to a large extent from a widespread misunderstanding about the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism. Anti-Semitism is not merely a form of racism to be analyzed with the tools provided by research on racism. Rather, anti-Semitism is a distinctive ideology that cannot be reduced to racism any more than homophobia can be reduced to sexism. We have here a variation of the feminist paradox that we cannot understand the circumstances and living conditions of women and men if we only look at them through the category of gender, but nor will we understand them without the category of gender. In regard to anti-Semitism as a phenomenon, we can say that we will fail to grasp anti-Semitism's complexity if we see anti-Semitism only as a form of racism, but we will not understand anti-Semitism if we do not also recognize anti-Semitism as a form of racism. In order to prevent competitive victimhood and to facilitate alliances in the fight against anti-Semitism and racism, Glenn's cousin and Robert Fine, whose book I have on my YouTube channel already, so you should check it out now, proposed that we think of anti-Semitism and racism as related ideologies. They warned against the complete subsumption of anti-Semitism under the abstract umbrella term of, quote, racism, end quote, arguing that such conceptual fuzziness should only make the respective specificities of anti-Semitism and racism disappear. There is no doubt that anti-Semitism operates with numerous racist elements, as well as with nationalist, sexist, and homophobic ones. Racism is evident already in the concept of anti-Semitism, a linguistic invention of Wilhelm Marr in the 19th century, when a political and social hostility towards Jews, with a secular pseudoscientific concept of, quote, race, end quote, to the fore, replaced a pre-modern religious form of anti-Judaism. As I have discussed elsewhere, Stögner, 2014, this shift became evident particularly in anti-Semitic body images that depicted Jews as having a distorted relationship to nature. Capitalism and the, quote, greedy Jew, end quote. Racism is unquestionably an important moment for the functioning of anti-Semitism as a modern ideology. But racism is not the only moment. Modern anti-Semitism operates substantially on the basis of a distorted perception of capitalist relations of production and the capitalist relations of production's logic of exploitation. Anti-Semitism in the figure of the, quote, greedy Jew, end quote, introduces a personalization of what are in reality supra-individual abstract social processes. This is combined with an anti-intellectualism that sees Jews as a subversive and disintegrating spirit, quote, too clever by half, end quote. Anti-Semitism is essentially about the rejection of, quote, spirit and money, end quote, expressing a deep unease and discontent in civilization, and an inability to understand abstract power relations, and those abstract power relations, institutions. The differences between anti-Semitism and racism are clear. Both colonial and apartheid racism is based on the hierarchical construction of supposedly superior and inferior races. Balibar, 2005. The enemy constructed as primitive and inferior represents a lack of civilization and modernity, while racists consider themselves representatives of civilization. Absent are conspiracy myths presuming people of color and colonized people secretly rule the world, control the media and finance, and accelerate the process of modernization, globalization, and cosmopolitanism. These are not usually part of a racist ideology. Such conspiracy myths, however, are an essential feature of anti-Semitism, which suspects an intangible power resides among Jews, one that is ubiquitous, and to which anti-Semites do not feel superior, but rather inferior. A current example of the idea of the all-powerful Jew that sits at the heart of anti-Semitic ideology is the conspiracy myth that Jews control migration flows and are thus responsible for what the extreme right wing calls, quote, foreign infiltration and domination, end quote, i.e. for the immigration of people regarded as ethnically or culturally inferior, which result in the destruction of, quote, native, end quote, identity. The portrayal of Jews as an abstract, intangible elite who secretly rule the world and oppress peoples and nations can be observed also on the left. In this version, anti-Semitism can even claim to be oppositional and on the side of the oppressed worldwide. Whiteness and Jews. Many intersectional feminist movements that stand up against racism have great difficulty in grasping how anti-Semitism works. They understand anti-Semitism as only a form of racism, while they reduce racism itself to the dichotomy of white and black, with Jews implicitly or explicitly identified with, quote, whiteness, end quote. This is analytically disabling because anti-Semitism does not run along the color line, and consequently not along the binary divide, quote, privileged/non-privileged, end quote. Jews are not, quote, whites, end quote. However, both, quote, whiteness and, quote, privileged/non-privileged, end quote, are central to the concept of racism that is prevalent today in academic discourse and in the discourse of intersectional political practice. The whiteness frame, as a tool for making visible structural racism, not only proves to be completely unsuitable for anti-Semitism, but can even confirm anti-Semitism, as David Schraub, 2019, pointed out. The privileges associated with whiteness include power, influence, money, property, education, dominance, participation, being heard and having a voice, cliques and networks, and positions inherited over generations. If this frame is applied to the white majority society, ingrained power structures can be made visible. If, on the other hand, it is applied to the Jewish minority, this frame can actually result in the confirmation of anti-Semitic stereotypes, such as the excessive influence of Jews in business, politics, and the media. Jews appear as the super whites. Schraub observes that, quote, the hope in applying the whiteness frame to Gentile white is to unsettle received understandings of the white experience, to make people see things they had not seen before. By contrast, the effect of applying whiteness to Jewishness is confirmatory. Quote, I always thought that Jews had all this power and privilege, and now I see how right I was. End quote. The exclusion of global anti-Semitism from anti-racist intersectional analyses and practices means that Jews are increasingly not recognized as a minority that has been racially persecuted and murdered for centuries, and Israel is not recognized as a refuge for Jews worldwide after the Shoah. Instead, Jews appear as representatives of an exploitative, structurally racist group, and Israel appears as a bastion of Western imperialism in the Middle East, as an artificial and alien element in the midst of supposedly autochthonous Arab peoples. Hirsch, 2018, Nelson, 2019. That's David Hirsch and Carrie Nelson, if anyone cared to look them up. By completely subsuming anti-Semitism under the category of, quote, racism, end quote, it appears to be the problem of bygone times. In fact, while anti-Semitism and racism are historically closely related, anti-Semitism and racism have developed in different directions after the Shoah and in post-colonial context. Contemporary anti-Semitism no longer primarily operates as a racism, but is changed into post-national forms, in which Israel is utilized as a universal scapegoat for wars and crises worldwide. The discrimination against Jews today is different from that of people of color. If this difference is not recognized, current forms of anti-Semitism that differ from racism, such as anti-Semitism related to Israel, not only disappear from view, but can also mask themselves as anti-racist and oppositional. Thus, over-inclusion, treating anti-Semitism simply as racism, necessarily leads to the problem of under-inclusion. Contemporary anti-Semitism is not viewed as racism at all, and the fight against anti-Semitism is less and less recognized as part of the anti-racist struggle, and can even be considered to be itself conservative, reactionary, even racist. Lost in translation, quote, intersectionality, end quote, across context. Kimberly Crenshaw defines intersectionality as, quote, a way of seeing, thinking, and acting, end quote, thus raising the problem of the transferability of the concept to other oppressions. If intersectionality does not want to be merely a buzzword or be mentioned purely doxographically, according to the motto, quote, don't use that concept, only mention it, end quote, then clear thinking about its translation from one context into another is necessary. To that end, Gudrun Alexei Knapp advises us to conceive of intersectionality as a, quote, traveling concept, end quote, one that brings pieces of luggage on its journey, some of which may be inappropriate in a changed context. If this, quote, baggage, end quote, means that anti-Semitism cannot be adequately grasped, then the analytical value of the concept of intersectionality must come under question. The concept of intersectionality actually functions today to underpin some of the assumptions of contemporary anti-Semitism. For example, in the political practice of certain queer and feminist activists, the so-called Queer International, Israelis en masse are considered to be on the privileged side of global power relations, and so anti-Semitism is no longer perceived as a concrete danger. There's a great deal of ingenuity in interpreting Israel as a depravity for doing what activists are actually doing elsewhere, or actually advocating elsewhere, women's and LGBTIQ rights. For Israel, however, all is reversed, making possible the accusation of, quote, pinkwashing, end quote, homo-nationalism, end quote. Schulman, 2012, Poir, 2013. There has arisen resistance to the exclusion of Jews from queer and feminist initiatives such as Women's March on Washington, Chicago Dyke March, or Black Lives Matter, the journalist and LGBTIQ activist Gretchen Hammond lost her job at the Windy City Times after she made public the anti-Semitism of the Chicago Dyke March organizers. Feminists such as Emily Shire, 2017, refused to accept the argument of Linda Sarsour, the former organizer of the Women's March on Washington, that Zionism and feminism would exclude and contradict each other, while Anna Isaacs, 2016, elaborated on the complexity of the Black Lives Matter movement, which in the beginning did not exclude Jewish experiences and also included a focus on anti-Semitism. Likewise, former Jewish comrades on Women's March on Washington have been forced to withdraw or to launch their own feminist intersectional campaigns that are all dedicated to educating the public about anti-Semitism, such as Women for All or Zionists. Bringing anti-Semitism back in, reclaiming intersectionality for the Jews. In the face of this growing political abuse of the concept of intersectionality in many feminist and anti-racist movements, and the opening it has offered to anti-Semitism, some reject it completely. I argue for a critical reclaiming of the approach, suitably reformed in ways I suggest below, informed by certain advances made by the Frankfurt School. I believe the concept can strengthen our analysis of contemporary societies and be particularly fruitful for ideology critique. Learning from the Frankfurt School. A closer look at the history of sociological and social psychological thought shows that the treatment of anti-Semitism in the early critical theory of the Frankfurt School anticipated later concepts of intersectionality. The broad empirical studies in the authoritarian personality conducted by Theodor Adorno, Elsa Frankel-Brunswick, or maybe it's Elsa Frankel-Brunswick. I'm not sure if that's how close they are to Germany or not. Anyway, and colleagues at Columbia University in the 1940s had the aim of measuring the authoritarian fascist potential across the American population. One of its most prominent discoveries was that ideologies such as anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, homophobia, ethnocentrism, and nationalism rarely occur as isolated phenomena but develop within a broader framework. The authoritarian ideological attitudinal syndrome, Adorno. Ideologies, then, are certainly intersectional. Ideologies permeate and reinforce each other, constantly reforming and reactivating themselves in this process. Moreover, depending on political expediency, one ideology can come to the fore at any one time, while the others continue to operate in the background, able to be called up. The intersectionality of ideologies. This insight from Adorno et al. Helps us to pose the question of how the ideology of anti-Semitism intersects with the ideologies of sexism, racism, and nationalism. How do anti-Semitic motives shine through in anti-feminism? How does nationalism or anti-genderism, as a particular variation of anti-feminism, cover up latent anti-Semitism? To address such questions, I have developed the concept of intersectionality of ideologies. Stögner, 2014, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2019. I do not mean that ideologies are interchangeable or should be equated. Rather, following Oscar Necht, I believe we can distinguish between ideologies while understanding that ideologies gain their respective specificity precisely from their interaction with other ideologies. Such an approach has radical implications for our understanding of the functioning not only of anti-Semitism, but also of anti-feminism, sexism, homophobia, racism, and nationalism. I am proposing a change in perspective in intersectionality research. My ideology critical approach would shift our attention from the level of identity formation, which is often in the foreground today, to the level of the ideological concealment of social contradictions. Moreover, this approach also focuses on the question of why repressive social categorization and identification takes place at all. This further shift in focus, by making visible our compulsion to categorize and identify as a ruling practice, also helps us grasp why and when this compulsion may sometimes permeate identity politics itself with bad consequences. Ideologies are best understood as being interdependent. Ideologies not only usually appear in a bundle, but each ideology also carries moments of the other ideologies within themselves, and they thus merge together. Due to its complexity, anti-Semitism is particularly suitable for an understanding of this kind, which we can call an intersectional analysis. Anti-Semitism is permeated by sexism, racism, and nationalism while reflecting the economic class relationship in a completely delusory and distorted way, masquerading as a critique of capitalism. Anti-Semitism can be understood as the example par excellence of an ideology shot through with the marks of other ideologies. Anti-Semitism pushes the Jews beyond the stable categories of intersectionality. Most societies are organized along binary markers such as bottom-up, inside-out, white-black, male-female, hetero, lesbian/gay. Accordingly, ideologies such as racism, sexism, homophobia, nationalism, and ethnocentrism position people of color, women, gays, and lesbians, foreigners, and strangers more or less unambiguously along these binary codes. Anti-Semitism, by contrast, is characterized by ambivalence with regard to these markers. It does not position Jews unambiguously on one or the other side of these markers, but rather attributes to Jews a position beyond binary categorization. The history of anti-Semitism shows that Jews are regarded as unclassifiable in the three dimensions that are central to the classical intersectionality approach: gender/sexuality, class and race/ethnicity/nation. This can be seen in the 19th century figure of the anti-national Jew, who supposedly questioned the principle of nationhood, no less than in the image of the Jew as a, quote, gender bender, end quote, who thwarts gender binarity. In anti-Semitism, Jews are not clearly assigned to classes either, but identified simultaneously with communism and capitalism, especially with financial capital. Jews do not so much represent a foreign hostile identity, but rather a non-identity. In other words, the threat of the dissolution of identity itself, or unity itself. The anti-categorical character of anti-Semitic stereotypes makes it hard to grasp for dominant intersectional approaches that assume the interdependence of stable categories. Anti-Semitism denies Jews any clear categorization and derives its effectiveness and efficiency from an almost, quote, queer, end quote, thwarting of familiar binaries and from undermining clear categorizations. Anti-Semitism itself blurs the categories and portrays the Jew as not belonging to any identity criteria. Anti-Semitism is a particular fear that the unity and identity of the nation, religion, community, etc. might be infiltrated and decomposed. Conspiracy myths are a manifestation of this fear. In this context, Jews do not represent a foreign and/or hostile identity, but rather an anti-identity, i.e. the dissolvent of fixed boundaries of collective cultural identities. Here a difference to newer forms of racism like cultural racism and, quote, racism without races, end quote, becomes clear. For example, anti-Muslim resentment ascribes to Muslims a hermetically sealed and fixed identity. In anti-Semitism, by contrast, Jews are characterized as lacking identity or roots. The National Socialist mania saw Jews not as a, quote, alien race, end quote, that was to be subjugated and exploited, but as a anti-race, the, quote, negative principle as such, on whose extermination the salvation of the world was to depend. The mania of redemption through exterminatory anti-Semitism emerged from a view of Jews as settled in a non-place beyond the authoritative categorical order of the world. Let us review the various non-places to which the Jew is consigned by anti-Semitism. The, quote, anti-national Jew, end quote. Anti-Semitism depicts Jews as not loyal to any nation and incapable of establishing true statehood. It dates back to the time of the European nation-state formation in the late 18th and 19th centuries and inverted the fact that Jews as people had no nation state of their own into the stereotype that they would infiltrate other nations and undermine the national principle from within. They were considered international, cosmopolitan, free-floating, rootless, inauthentic, and untrustworthy in terms of their national identification. Nationalism and the construction of a homogeneous national community were not only directed against external enemies, but also developed through the explicit exclusion of, quote, foreign and, quote, non-belonging elements within the national borders. The figure of the anti-national Jew served thereby as a projection screen for unacknowledged uncertainties and antagonisms within the modern nation-state, as well as for the legitimation of nationalistic exclusions. Ethnic, and to a lesser degree also civic, nationalism effectively covers up the division of society according to economic classes and pretends a unity that is in reality highly fragile. The break in the unity is projected onto the, quote, anti-national Jew, end quote. This motif recurs in extreme anti-Zionism, which rejects Jewish statehood as a, quote, artificial entity, end quote, and today ranges from neo-Nazi to Islamist and anti-imperialist discourses. Quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, discourses. Anti-imperialism is in quotes. Neo-Nazi and Islamist is not in quotes. The, quote, Jewish gender bender, end quote. Countless are the images, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, which ascribed an ambiguous gender and sexuality to Jews. Anti-Semitism traditionally considered Jewish men to be effeminate, Jewish women to be masculinized. They were said to blur the clearly drawn boundaries between the genders, to dissolve gender identity, reversing gender roles and gender-specific division of labor. Consequently, women's emancipation was also interpreted as Jewish machination against the unity of the people. Due to the intermediate position regarding gender and sexuality attributed to them, Jews were seen as an essential threat to the unity of the cultural community, which is still inseparably linked to the heteronormative order today. Emancipated women who claimed autonomous subjectivity and sexuality were considered part of a Jewish conspiracy. The, quote, Jewish democratic feminist Maimon spirit, end quote, as the Nazi mastermind Ludwig Langemann formulated it in 1919. This is by no means overcome today, as we can see in the right-wing anti-gender ideologies across Europe and America, in which feminism functions as the new scapegoat of a current identity crisis. Islamists express the close connection between anti-Semitism and anti-genderism more explicitly. For example, the supreme spiritual leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, sees in the objectification of women, quote, the objectification of women, end quote, in the West, and quote, concepts like gender justice, end quote, a, quote, Zionist plot to destroy human community, end quote. Or take the Algerian Islamist Malik Benabi, who in the 1960s swaggered about the, quote, century of the woman, the Jew, and the dollar, end quote, and thus summarized the threats to the Islamic Ummah that were central to him. Ben Susan, 2019. The Jew is, quote, misfit bourgeois, end quote. One major characteristic of anti-Semitism's classical inventory is that Jews are identified with the intermediary economic sphere of circulation, i.e. with trade, banking, and money transactions, and are also primarily seen as speculators and financial capitalists. In feudal traditional societies, Jews were denied access to landed property and to craft guilds, just as in modern functionally differentiated capitalist society, Jews were excluded from ownership of the means of production, the source of surplus value for a very long period. They were therefore increasingly forced into the intermediary sphere of circulation. That all bankers were Jews and all Jews were engaged in money transactions, on the other hand, has always been an anti-Semitic cliché, closely linked to the anti-Semitic idea that the Jews will not work. This in turn announces the ideological division of the capital relation into, quote, productive, end quote, rapacious, end quote. The position of the trader is an intermediate one that makes the class position appear ambiguous and vague. Jews were neither masters nor servants. They attributed themselves to the class of the bourgeois. They encountered the cliché of the, quote, misfit bourgeois. Oh, if they attributed themselves to the class of the bourgeois, the Jews encountered the cliché of the, quote, misfit bourgeois, end quote, who would only imitate the capitalist business while lacking any feeling or real and sincere entrepreneurship, and therefore representing the negative effects of capitalism in its purest form. As the voice of the working class, they were seen as hypocrites, speaking from a position alienated from all physical labor, about things they knew nothing about. Conclusion: intersectionality cannot be an emancipatory theory while excluding anti-Semitism. Inconsistency, ambiguity, and comprehensive unclassifiability, fluid boundaries and manifold overlaps with other ideologies. These are the reasons why anti-Semitism has developed into a comprehensive and delusional worldview. In the course of the rapid and disruptive modernization process, it has helped to stabilize a system of values and norms that appeared to be under threat. More than other ideologies, anti-Semitism helps to maintain the traditional rules of capitalism, patriarchy, and nation-state order by always being sexist, homophobic, nationalist, and racist, and in addition to posing as anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. The consistently anti-categorical moment, by positing Jews beyond the categories, distinguishes anti-Semitism from other ideologies which are much less ambiguous. This insight challenges those approaches that assume there must be a critical potential in an anti-categorical view. Anti-Semitism itself transgresses categorization effectively, positing Jews beyond gender, sexuality, class, race, ethnicity, and nation. Anti-Semitism, again, gains its effectiveness from exactly this characteristic. We have to understand the banality that in anti-Semitism everything can be interpreted against Jews, particularly that they allegedly do not correspond to the socially prescribed categories. An intersectional approach must not be limited to the insight that society is structured by certain categories, but must, in a radical critique of power, uncover the social reasons and conditions of these categories. The process of perennial categorization of people in society and the underlying traditional identity logics must be criticized. The approach of intersectionality of ideologies proposed here is therefore critical of approaches that support an identitarian and cultural relativist discourse and can tip in the direction of anti-Semitism and homophobia under the guise of anti-racism. The critique of intersectionality presented here is intended to open the approach to a dialectical feminist theory that does not blind out anti-Semitism and which is therefore connected to truly emancipatory practice.